Since the beginning of recorded time, humans have experienced an almost limitless amount of control over the world. They selectively bred animals and plants to suit their needs, they could alter the weather with a wave of their hand, they could bend universal laws to breaking point in their laboratories. But the one thing they never really had control over was themselves. And it was this, one could even say the defining feature of humanity, that was to be their undoing. It started with a company called Panoptica. Their eccentric CEO quickly drew in massive amounts of revenue from investors with the promise of a revolutionary new technology. The company had made a name for themselves in artificial intelligence, when their product quickly became the largest search engine in the world in a matter of days. But it was their next product that would shape the course of human history. It was the next stage in human evolution, the CEO promised the world. The future that science fiction writers had predicted for the last few decades, and now it was finally here. Humanity watched in awe as the CEO revealed the latest product in a technology summit before all the major world leaders, the implant. The premise of the device was simple. Inserted directly onto the retina and connected via silicon nerve interfaces to the optic nerve, the implant could generate an artificial version of sensory data. Since a conscious experience was determined by a particular pattern of neural activity, if it was possible to induce that pattern of neural activity, it would be possible to induce that conscious experience. And this is exactly what the implant allowed the user to do. It could generate an artificial version of any sensory data imaginable, which opened up the full spectrum of possible conscious experiences. The imagination was far more boundless than the confines of reality, and users quickly started mapping out the terrain of this uncharted territory. Artificial sensory experiences, artificial social experiences, and it wasn't all that uncommon to have artificial sexual experiences as well. Some users chose to meet with the gods of their choice, and others chose to communicate with their dead ancestors, which could be artificed with almost perfect accuracy. With the implant, users indulged in never-ending fantasies and escaped into their own scorched sliver of utopia. When given the choice between living a mundane truth or a wondrous lie, the choice was not a difficult one, and so the technology was adopted quickly. There were a few who chose to abstain from the implant, but they were few and far between. Most of them were religious zealots who cared far too much for spirituality in a time where there were no spirits to be found, and they all left to form their own fringe colonies in the areas of the earth that had been left abandoned, mountainous regions away from civilization. As for those that embraced the implant, at first, as with all new technology, they were captivated by the novelty of the device. They could travel to distant alien worlds, experience the conditions on a neutron star, and watch the future collision of the Milky Way with Andromeda, all without the need to leave one's own home. All this started with a need for more, and who can blame them? The ability to change the world on a whim. Doesn't that sound intoxicating? When the universe began to ask too much of them, to decide for themselves what their place was in the cosmic drama, humans escaped outside where it couldn't find them, refusing the call of transcendence as long as it challenged the status quo. The vermiculate patterns of the stars that had once arced across the skies were now projected directly onto the darkness inside their skulls. And they couldn't have been any happier. The CEO watched as his technology spread across the world like the wildfires that scorched the uninhabitable zones of the planet. But that's what wildfires are for, he thought. Clearing out the old generation and returning the nutrients into the soil for the new generation. As time passed, newer versions of the implant were released. With each new version, the fidelity of the sensorium was increased immeasurably, so much so that it became almost impossible to continue using older versions. The implant went from a silicon chip on the retina to silicon replacements of the neurons in the brain, which opened up even more possibilities for artificial sensations. The operation was a technical procedure, performed by nanorobots that mapped the user's connectome, deconstructed their biological neurons, and then assembled the artificial neurons in their place. Panoptica-funded research discovered that the operation had a much higher success rate when performed on infants due to their greater neuroplasticity. So as new generations of humans were born, the real ones, not the ones born in artificial experiences, the custom was to have an implant installed at birth. Do the tests, give the injections, install the implant. It came to the point where it was seen as a human right to have access to the technology. To not have the implant, and thus to not have access to the full spectrum of human experiences, was seen as immoral. And so humanity became part human and part machine. The artificial worlds were so absorbing that users often started to neglect their real biological bodies. To keep them alive, they were fed a nutrient solution through microneedles on their skin, and their bodily waste was dealt with in a similar automatic fashion. Users never needed to leave their artificial worlds, but that was alright because they never wanted to. As the artificial worlds became more complex, it became apparent that the brain had too little bandwidth to process all the information. So, just like the computers of old, it became necessary to offload some of this information onto an external drive. Brain activity was mostly dedicated to those bodily processes like sensorimotor control, the breathing of the lungs, and the beating of the heart. These were autonomic processes that could be easily controlled and monitored, and as newer versions of the implant were released, they came with the power to handle it. Over time, even the higher bandwidth processes were uploaded as well. Memories, in particular, used a lot of valuable brain storage which could be used for richer artificial sensations, and so these were uploaded to a complex cloud storage database called the memory reservoir. Here they could be retrieved at any time, thanks to the silicon neurons in the brain, but they didn't take up space in the user's actual brain. It was a technological marvel. The memory reservoir was the largest collection of experiences ever assembled into one place. It was like social media in the early days of the internet, if the posts were every bit of sensory information the user ever experienced. There was a massive amount of infrastructure required to keep it online. Not that any human ran it, of course. There were AIs to take care of that, a more advanced version than the ones that were available to the public. They occasionally made mistakes, but since the memories were not stored in the user's brains anymore, nobody noticed when a few memories went missing. At this point in human history, the world was full of humans, but none of them were ever really there. Each of them had devices which acted as a veil between them and the world, and there was no communication. All their memories were stored in the memory reservoir. Humanity had been turned into zombies. They had all the appearance of an inner conscious life, but this was just an illusion. Any semblance of consciousness left in the world was stored on a cloud server and accessed on demand. The people down here were husks, the wetware required to run ever more detailed artificial worlds. The brain was the most complex computer in the universe, and Panoptica was putting it to good use to generate an obscene amount of revenue. With the collective memories of the human race stored in the memory reservoir, the introduction of a subscription plan to access them was sure to be profitable. It caused a minor outrage at first, but users were now so reliant on the implant that there was little option but to pay up. By the time Panoptica introduced adverts superimposed onto the memories, which could not be removed no matter which subscription the users paid for, it was barely met with any resistance. While these humans lived in the clean and futuristic digital worlds, the real world could not have been more different. Cities which once held shops, office blocks, and entertainment complexes were now totally overrun by data centers. Rows upon rows of the black monoliths, as tall as skyscrapers, littered the landscape. Thick cables snaked down them and connected into even thicker bundles that crisscrossed the streets. The sound of birds in the trees had been replaced with fans which hummed perpetually in an attempt to keep the data centers from overheating. It was the same picture in cities and towns all across the world. The dreamscapes that had been created for humanity did not include all the physical hardware that was needed to support and maintain them. It was all hidden in the real world. Perhaps there was a moment in history where humanity could have reversed the course it had chosen for itself. But, much like when their ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors made the switch to agriculture, the choice was snatched out of their hands soon after it had started. They had signed their lives over to this technology, sold their consciousnesses to the corporations, and they couldn't have been happier about it. The CEO surveyed the world that he had created from his office at the top of the Panoptica tower. It was a sharp, angular superscraper that jutted over the cityscape. Like a fragment of obsidian, it looked as though it had burst through the earth from the inside. Below, the city stretched out to the horizon. It was a machine in the shape of a civilization. Every mind of every human on Earth was stored somewhere in those data centers, a flood of memories rushing along each one of those tangled cables. The CEO was an old man now, and almost at the end of his life. The cancer had eaten away much of his body. There was only so much an artificial enhancement could do. No neural recalibration or synthetic muscle fibers could hold back the inevitable. This was a lesson he hoped that humanity would learn very shortly. He turned away from the window, his reflection flickering for a moment against the endless sprawl of his creation. He knew that the moment had arrived. The lesson needed to be taught, but humanity would only understand it in the language it truly knew. He moved toward his desk. The final act was about to begin. He switched on the camera and started the broadcast. Hello, citizens of the world. I am the CEO of Panoptica. I've not shown my face for some time, but I created the world as you know it. I first addressed the world when I introduced the implant, heralding what I called the next stage of human evolution. Today, that evolution reaches its final step. Humanity has witnessed significant technological progress over a few short centuries. The world we inhabit today is unrecognizable to someone even a decade ago. But there's a dark side to progress. Once something has been created, it cannot be uncreated. Once the atomic bomb was made, the world lived under the threat of mutually assured destruction from then on. Once plastic was invented, there's billions of tons of it in the seas and the earth and our brains. And once the implant was created, well, look at you all. You surrendered the real world for an artificial one. You craved escape so deeply that you never thought to ask who controlled the reality you were escaping into. You allowed a company to rewrite your brains just so you could experience your delusions in higher definition. But before you hate me, understand this. I did not choose this path. You did. Humanity has decimated the natural world. You didn't stop to think about whether you should. All that mattered was whether you could. As you demanded more, this required more power, and that power needed to come from somewhere. Your insatiable need for more turned the earth into a mine, the soil into a deposit for raw materials. A sustainable life does not challenge the earth for more than it can provide. This constant challenge, this dare on the earth, resulted in where we are now. And the only way you could think to fix things was with more technology. But it wasn't until too late that we realized that there was something technology couldn't do. It couldn't fix the mistakes we made. And so what did you all do? Predictably, you ran away to an imaginary world and left the actual world to ruin. It was clear to me that the human species could no longer thrive under these conditions. we had seized control of our own evolution and evolved ourselves into extinction. I knew that it was too late for humanity to change their ways on their own, so I had to design another world, one so intoxicating that you could never let it go. And then I had to take it from you. There's a quote from an ancient emperor. "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly." My sincerest hope is that, knowing what it feels like to lose everything, humanity will finally learn. We only have one home. I will go down in history as the villain of humanity's story, but history will not matter if there's no one left to remember it. If this is what it takes to save the world, then the ends justify the means. I hope you make the right decision. With that, the CEO switched off the broadcast. He let out a slow breath, staring at his own reflection in the darkened screen. There was no turning back now. He walked to the computer terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before he typed in the command. A single word appeared on the screen. Erase, with the words yes and no displayed smaller beneath it. With one final look over the world that he had created, the CEO pressed yes. For a moment, nothing happened. The world remained still, the hum of the data centers a steady, constant heartbeat. Then, one by one, the lights began to flicker and die. The great sprawling archives, millennia of history, knowledge, and memories were being deleted. As the hardware that supported the artificial worlds switched off, and humanity's collective memories were erased, the people themselves hardly noticed. None of them was stored in their brains anyway, and so they didn't even notice when they disappeared. Humanity was a tabula rasa, stripped of their life support and left on their own for the first time in millennia. The city stood empty. The sky above, for the first time in centuries, was free of artificial light. Humanity, stripped of its memories, had returned to silence, to stillness, to nothing. But in that nothingness, the CEO saw the possibility of something new. He smiled.